Carbohydrates. I'm Aaron Arnold, and I approved this message. Let's talk about carbs. Carbohydrates, most simply put, are just sugars, and they're also the very beginning of the food chain. You see, when plants capture sunlight, they turn it into glucose, which is a type of sugar. And on that point, pretty much everybody agrees, but the farther up the food chain we go, the more people start to have differing perspectives. And we're going to have a little fun with that today and see if we can distill some truth from the conversation and give you some actually useful information that will help you make the best food choices for your body and your lifestyle. Okay, so it all starts with plants using photosynthesis to capture sunlight and turn it into sugar. Specifically, they turn it into glucose, which is a simple sugar, also known as a monosaccharide. Mono because it comprises just one type of sugar molecule. By definition, monosaccharides can't be broken down into anything more simple because they are already the most simple form of sugar. The glucose that plants make is the most abundant type of monosaccharide and the basic building block of other sugars. Glucose is also what cellulose is made of, and cellulose is what plants are made of. So, when animals eat plants, they ingest carbohydrate, and when those animals are eaten by other animals and or fungi, that gets passed up the food chain as those animals and fungi get eaten by yet other animals and fungi, which in turn get eaten by yet other animals and fungi in what one brilliant writer once called a life-death symphony that defies all imagination. And it's been playing for about 3.8 billion years, so apparently it works pretty well. And it all starts with a humble little monosaccharide we know as glucose. Glucose isn't the only monosaccharide. Another common simple sugar you might have heard of is fructose, which is the simple sugar found in fruit, honey, and syrup. When a glucose and a fructose are joined together, they make a disaccharide, di meaning two. In this case, that disaccharide is called sucrose, also known as table sugar. Other well-known disaccharides include lactose and maltose. Disaccharides are also often referred to as simple sugars, though strictly speaking, they aren't really truly simple because they're made from two different sugars. But the pathway to breaking them down is so short that nutritionally, we call them simple sugars. Now, if you mash up three or more sugar molecules, that's called a polysaccharide, also known as a complex carbohydrate. The most prolific polysaccharide is our old friend cellulose, so that means that polysaccharides are the most abundant carbohydrate on Earth. We also use the terms complex carbohydrates and simple carbohydrates to refer to the foods that contain them. So, for example, we might call honey a simple carb, while we call whole grain a complex carb. The whole thing comes full circle when the carbs enter your bloodstream because before your cells can absorb them, they have to be turned back into glucose. That glucose in your veins is also called blood sugar. So if you eat a bunch of complex carbs, your body has to break down all those long chains of polysaccharides and turn them into glucose, which takes a little time. If you eat a bunch of table sugar, on the other hand, your body still has to convert it into glucose, but since it's just a tiny little disaccharide, it breaks down a lot faster, so it's almost comical. The plants turn sunlight into simple carbs and then rearrange them into complex carbs, which your body then breaks back down into simple carbs. Now, you don't have to memorize all that. Just remember that simple carbs burn fast and complex carbs burn slow. That's really all you need to remember from all that. Now, it would almost seem like the most efficient way to eat would be to skip all that and just eat simple carbs, right? I mean, your body could process them so much faster than complex carbs. The thing is, though, that there is such a thing as too fast. In fact, eating too much fast burn carb can cause a lot of problems, and that is probably the most important thing to know about carbohydrates. Now, sometimes you hear people say that sugar is a poison or that sugar is an addictive drug. And just as often, you hear people argue that high fructose corn syrup is more dangerous than organic cane sugar. And there are jillions upon jillions of sugar substitutes out there whose manufacturers want you to think that they are harmless or even healthy. And for the most part, I'm not going to address those points in today's video. There are some sweeteners out there that don't burn the same as sugar, but the taste may or may not do it for you, and it might be worth your while to look into their health risks. But for the purposes of this video, the most important thing you need to understand is how quickly your body processes different types of carbs, and I'll give you a hint. Sugar doesn't care if it's organic or natural or made from one source or another. Your body responds to organic cane sugar identically to how it responds to good old beet sugar. Identical. When it comes to simple sugars, your body doesn't care about pedigree. It doesn't care if the sugar came from a sugar cane or a coconut. Even honey burns just as quickly as table sugar, but the great thing about honey is that the good stuff is loaded with nutrients. It can support your health in wonderful ways, but don't fool yourself. It is still sugar, and you need to think of it as sugar. We're going to do a whole video on honey one of these days, so keep watching the channel and like and subscribe so that you don't miss it. It's going to be a good one. Okay, but getting back to the most important thing to know about carbs, the speed at which your body processes them. Like, what's so bad about fast-burning carbs anyway? Well, to understand that, it's important to have a basic knowledge of what happens to carbs when you eat them. Like I said, your body breaks them down and turns a lot of them into glucose, which goes straight to your bloodstream, and that's your blood sugar. Blood sugar is the fuel your body uses to do stuff like walking, digesting, running, and pretty much everything. It's your right now energy, and it's the most primordial metabolic function. It works for us because of insulin. When your body detects blood sugar, your pancreas produces insulin. And insulin is a hormone that delivers glucose to your cells so that they can use it. Insulin has other functions too, but the thing it's really known for is regulating your blood sugar. Okay, very cool, but what happens when we have more blood sugar than we can use? Well, the leftover glucose gets converted into glycogen and sent to your muscles and your liver where it gets stored for later. After you've used up all the glucose in your bloodstream, all your blood sugar, your liver and muscles release their glycogen in the form of glucose so that your cells, along with the help of your insulin, can use that energy, and that is your gas tank. But what happens after your gas tank is full? Well, once your muscles and liver can't store any more glycogen, it gets converted into body fat and just kind of stored everywhere, all over your body, including the liver, where it can cause a lot of problems. We sometimes think of excess body fat as being stored on the belly or the hips or other obvious places, but it can also get stored around your internal organs, also known as your viscera, which is why we call that visceral fat, and it's actually kind of dangerous. That's why some people can look thin but actually have too much body fat, and that's why the measurement known as a BMI, or body mass index, is flawed. You might have seen those charts that compare your height with your weight and then tell you if you're healthy. Well, the problem with those is that they don't account for visceral fat, and visceral fat can be really bad news. Another effect of too much blood sugar is that your pancreas starts working super hard to make enough insulin to keep up, and eventually your body just stops responding to it properly, and that's called insulin resistance. When that happens, the only way for your body to process the blood sugar is to make more insulin. And after a while, your pancreas just gets overtaxed and can't make enough insulin to keep up with all that excess blood sugar. Type 2 diabetes is basically a combination of too much blood sugar and not enough insulin, and a resistance to the insulin you do have. Diabetes can lead to heart disease, vision loss, stroke, neuropathy, foot amputation, and vascular damage. And when you hear people talk about metabolic syndrome, that's actually kind of a catch-all phrase to describe all the things that go wrong when your metabolism is out of whack, but type 2 diabetes is usually the first thing on the list. It used to be called adult onset diabetes, but we've gotten to the point now where children are becoming diabetic or pre-diabetic before reaching puberty. Today's kids are likely to be the first generation in human history to have a shorter lifespan than their parents, and metabolic syndrome is the main culprit. So it's important to understand this sugar stuff. So does this mean that carbohydrates are bad? I don't think so. Now, I need to recognize that there is no shortage of people who disagree with me. You don't have to look very far to find folks who will tell you flat out that carbohydrates are categorically unhealthy, and I am not one of them. Firstly, a lot of foods that people consider carbs are really healthy. I would never consider eliminating Brussels sprouts, sweet potatoes, beets, or radishes. And secondly, it's important to understand that complex carbs are processed very differently. Because of their long, complex molecular structure, it takes longer for your body to break them down into glucose, and because of that, they don't spike your insulin in the same way that sucrose does. The main player in that process is usually fiber. The more fiber in your food, the slower it burns. Complex carbs are generally high in fiber and usually contain lots of other nutrients, so they are not your enemy. Also, for what it's worth, when you look at the so-called blue zone populations, that is the places where the most people who live to be 100 live, they commonly eat starchy vegetables and noodles. There doesn't seem to be any one diet that shows up in all the blue zones, but what you do not find is people adhering to a carnivore diet. I'm pretty sure we're designed to eat vegetables. Well, that's my opinion anyway. I'm not a registered dietitian, so take it for what it's worth. In fact, this is one of the main contentions between vegans and certain paleo adherents. You might think it's the meat question that puts a wedge between them, and while that much is true, they also like to argue about, are you ready for this? Beans. Yes, beans. Vegans think of them as a great source of fiber, minerals, and aminos, while strict paleo followers say they're too high in carbs. Now, I'm going to side with the vegans on this one. Personally, I'm very pro-bean. I support beans, bean-adjacent lifestyles, and everything they stand for. They are high in carbs, yes, but they are the poster child for complex, slow-burn carbs because they deliver a lot of fiber. I want to go on record as a bean advocate. I am a bean ally. I never met a bean I didn't like. Heck, I even like lima beans. I'm Aaron Arnold, and I approved this message. Okay, so suppose you're on board with me here and you're not going to beat yourself up for eating a few beans here and there. But what about those fast burn carbs we talked about? Those are the baddies, right? Well, sometimes. And sometimes they're great. Remember, simple carbs are your right now energy. They're literally the stuff that 3.8 billion years of evolution has programmed every cell in your body to use as a fuel, and it's been that way literally since the Archaic. Your body runs on simple carbs. The glucose isn't the problem. The problem is how your body responds to having too much of it when you eat more than you burn. Okay, so the solution is simple. Use them. Hop on your bike, go take a hike, go to the gym, take a good swim, heck, even chores around the house, burn carbs. In fact, the point has been made to good effect that you need carbs to lead a healthy lifestyle. I mean, suppose you want to lose a few pounds of body fat and you've made the very good decision to ride your bike. Well, cool, but before you do, you're going to need gas in your tank. You need some fuel. Now that can totally come from some complex carbs and or fat if your body knows how to use it. But what if you're out for a ride and suddenly you feel a little wobbly? Well, what's happened is that you've crashed your blood sugar. You've used it all up, and that's not a great feeling, and you're not going to finish your ride and get all those health benefits. This is not the time for beans. You need some sugar, simple carbs, because your blood is out of gas. And that's why so many sports snacks and sports drinks are made from fast burn carbs like tapioca syrup and cane sugar. You need some right now energy, and guess what? Good news. This is a great time for a sugary sweet, so have at it. You have earned a cookie, but just make sure you burn it off. A similar thing applies right after your exercise, but you can't be quite as indulgent. When you finish your ride or run or whatever, you might have used up all your fuel, and you're going to need to replace it so that you don't just crash for the rest of the day. This is what people call your recovery, and I think different things work for different people. I'd say most people I've listened to over the years would tell you that you need a combination of carbs, fats, and proteins, and that each of those has an important role in helping you build new muscle and stay energized for the rest of the day. Now, personally, I like apple slices dipped in copious amounts of nut butter. It makes me feel amazing. Some people swear by chocolate milk. You gotta find what works for you, but this is no time to be afraid of carbohydrate. You need gas in your tank. So in my book, simple carbs are great during exercise, and a lot of folks say they're great for recovery, though personally, I like a good dose of fiber in there. Okay, all so far so good, but now you might be asking, how do I know which foods are fast burn and which ones are slow burn? Great question. You might have heard of something called the glycemic index, or its close cousin, glycemic load. Glycemic index is a number that tells you how quickly or slowly a food raises your blood sugar. Some foods high on the glycemic index include table sugar, instant white rice, white bread, or mashed potatoes. Those all have a glycemic index higher than 70 and will burn really fast in your body. Some low glycemic foods with a number between 0 and 10 include broccoli, hummus, and mushrooms. Then there are other foods that land somewhere in the middle, like dark chocolate, chilled potatoes, apples, and brown rice. Now, did you catch that? Instant white rice is high glycemic, but brown rice is medium, because the instant white rice burns faster because it's had its bran and germ removed, and it's been partially cooked before you buy it. Your body basically just has to finish it off. Another interesting one is the potatoes. If you chill them after you cook them, it changes their actual molecular structure somewhat, causing them to burn more slowly. You can even reheat them, and they'll still slow down a little. Boiled potatoes clock in at 77, which is pretty fast, while chilled potatoes land somewhere around 56, so that's pretty reasonable. Instant potatoes, by the way, run at 88, which is obscene. Now, when you look at these numbers, one trend you might see pretty immediately is that the more processing, the faster the burn. Similarly, foods high in fiber tend to have lower numbers. Some processed foods have the fiber-rich parts removed to increase palatability. White bread, white pasta, white rice are good examples. Now, in full disclosure, I should mention that there is at least one well-known dietitian who actually recommends white rice over brown because it has fewer lectins. Now, I recognize the validity of his thinking, but I think there are other benefits from brown rice that I find valuable. I also make what's called GABA rice, which is a setting on the rice cooker that causes the rice grains to sprout, which lowers the lectins and increases the nutritional content. So if you have a rice cooker with a GABA setting, I highly recommend using it. Now, the problem with the glycemic index is that it doesn't account for serving size, which means it's not always a real-world number. So enter the glycemic load. The glycemic load is a different number that accounts for the serving size and the amount of carbohydrate in the food, which is a little more realistic. Watermelon, for example, has a super high glycemic index of 80, but that's not real world because the carbs are kind of sparse. So you're not loading up on like 10 grams of sugar per bite or anything like that. And since watermelon is calorically sparse, it has a glycemic load of only 5. Because even though it is a fast burn, you're not actually getting that much sugar per serving, so it doesn't actually spike your blood sugar that much. Now, some people say both numbers are important and worth looking at, and some people have more time in their day than I have. For me, I try to pay some attention and use common sense. I've looked over a handful of lists, and there are tons of them on the interwebs, and I pay enough attention in general to know which foods are really calorically dense, which ones are fast burn, which ones are slow burn, and sure, sometimes I get it wrong, but I usually have a fair idea of when I'm eating something high in fast burn simple sugars, so I try to make good decisions that take that into account. I mean, I still love cookies and ice cream, but I try to make good life choices in general so that I can enjoy those things. Life is all about, what's that word? It's a B, begins with a B. It's a B. Oh, balance. That's it, balance. Life is all about balance. Now, if you're familiar with the keto diet, it's based on the approach that you can train your body to get its energy mostly from fat. After all, Fat is your body's long-term energy store, and it contains far more energy per gram than carbs. There's a lot of sense to the keto diet. Part of making it work, though, is that you have to spend some time training your body to prefer calories from fat. That's a metabolic state known as ketosis, and you achieve it by starting out with a very restrictive diet that severely limits carb intake and even eliminates certain foods. And then after a few days or weeks of that, you can start to slowly reintroduce some carbs and carb-rich foods within certain limits. Sadly, just like so many well-intentioned dietary guidelines, the word keto has become a marketing buzzword. You see it on food packaging in ridiculous ways. I've seen the word keto plastered on everything from beef jerky to black coffee, neither of which contains a single gram of carbohydrate in the first place. There's a well-known whipped cream substitute you've heard of that brags about being not only keto-friendly but also zero trans fats. The fact is that it's made primarily of trans fats, but it's so whipped up that it's mostly air, so the actual fat content is low enough to fly under the radar. And the same goes for the glycemic load. It's got sugar in it, to be sure, but it's so whipped up again that the carb content slips under the requirements and they can make all their BS claims without getting into trouble. So yeah, you gotta think for yourself, I'm afraid. I know it hurts, but you gotta do it. Sorry. I've read mixed reviews on the keto diet. It seems like it might be effective for actually reversing diabetes and weight loss, but there are some indications that it may not be the best long-term diet. It seems to me that it all comes back to the foods we evolved to eat, and no, I'm not talking carnivore. As I've said before, I think our ancestors favored the foods that did not run away or fight back, and the fossil record strongly supports that. As you've heard me say, and will hopefully hear me say a million more times, it all comes back to leafy greens. Kale, chard, lettuce, collard, and everything in the cabbage family, including broccoli and cauliflower, and I'm inherently suspicious of people who say those things are unhealthy. If you like meat, then enjoy it in healthy amounts and try to buy the pastured or better yet, regeneratively farmed stuff, preferably from a local producer who actually cares about the place you live. Carbs, in my opinion, are your friend, but just like everything else, you need to employ some wisdom. Look at the glycemic numbers and don't beat yourself up or get obsessed or neurotic. Make sure everything you eat comes with a healthy serving of joy. Eat food that makes you happy and supports your body. Go ahead and eat simple carbs, just make sure you use them, because it's the unused ones that get you into trouble. We seem to be designed to eat a balance of carbs, fats, and proteins, and I strongly feel that that's what has always worked best for me. If there's one number to pay attention to, it's the ratio between calories and nutrition. If something is high in calories but low in nutrition, like fast food French fries maybe, then that's something you eat very little of. If something is very high in nutrition but low in calories, like kale, then load up on that and do it in a way that makes you happy. There was a lot to unpack here, so I had to kind of glide through a lot of it, but if there are any topics you'd like us to learn more about, let me know in the comments and we'll go a little deeper, and I'm sure that there will be more on this topic to come. But for now, it's time to wrap up this video. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you next time. Ciao. I'm Aaron Arnold, and I approved this message.